So my name is Gregory Asmolov. I'm a PhD student in the London School of Economics and Media and Communication Department, and I'm working with Robin Mansell on research about the role of crowdsourcing for response to emergency situations. The presentation that I'm going to present today is related to my major research. At the same time, it has a different focus on from my major work. So I tried to use my fieldwork that I conducted during over the last year in Russia and in Australia and in some other countries, and I will talk a little more about it in order to fit the framework and to talk about development both on the theoretical and the empirical level. So without further review, I would like to start. First, generally, this topic of information technologies and natural disasters is very popular during the last years. You could see a lot of papers, research, and publications, in particular following the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, when USAID played a significant role in the facilitation of emergency response, and there are a lot of arguments and a lot of debates about the role of the crowdsourcing for emergency response following the earthquake, and some other disasters that every time you can see that disaster is actually a time of innovation, and as a part of the response to disaster you always can see development of new applications and development of new forms of application of information technologies as a part of response to emergency situation. So that's a general field. I also had some kind of personal involvement in an issue of the disaster, and I have to mention it as a part of the background, since it's really important for what I'm going to talk about on the about my research. In 2010, the same year when the earthquake took place in Haiti, Russia experienced very significant wildfires. And at this point of time, I was an intern and research assistant at the Berkman Center during summer 2010. And from Boston, I kind of co-founded and initiated a platform that was based on USAID that was called HelpMap. And the purpose of this platform was to facilitate mutual aid between those who need help and those who are interested in helping during the disaster, during Russian wildfires. And this project was relatively successful because we received a lot of attention. We had more than 200,000 people who used the platform. We had a few thousand messages. We received some prizes for this platform, including the Russian official National Internet Award. And that was kind of starting point for me for being interested in the role of information technologies in response to natural disasters. Later, with my colleagues from Internews in Washington, D.C., we wrote a report about social change and the Russian network society, redefining development priorities in new information environments that focused on Russian case studies and discussing how information technologies can contribute to development. And also later with one of my colleagues who actually participated in the HelpMap project, Alexei Sidorenko, you can see him here. We launched a project, and he's the director of a project in Moscow today that's called Teplitsa, Warm House for Social Innovation, which is kind of focusing on supporting bottom-up innovation on the field of social, on the field of information technologies, and primarily working with different types of NGOs. So on the one hand, I was interested on the practical issues. On the other hand, I was really interested in trying to understand how the same technologies play in different roles in similar type of situations. So here on this slide, you can see that the same platform, USAID, was used in the same type of situations, which is wildfires, in different countries. Here on the left, this is the Russian project HelpMap, and here on the right, it's a Bushfire Connect project in Australia. That was also developed as a part of response to natural disasters, in this case bushfires. So that's why my initial interest was in comparative analysis of the role of the similar platforms in similar situations in different political environments, and that's also why the structure of my case studies is a little bit different from what is considered to be as a typical case studies for ICT for development. So it's not focusing on what is traditionally considered as developing countries, in this case Russia and Australia, and my fieldwork was conducted in Russia and in Australia. But as I will try to argue in my presentation, there are some interesting insights, and there are some valuable information that can be found for the topic of information technologies and development in these case studies that are not considered to be as typical case studies for ICT for development. So let me first to introduce kind of analytical framework for what I'm going to talk about. It's there is a triangle of three things that I would like to discuss. So we're talking about the triangle of development, emergencies, and crowdsourcing. So there are a lot of obviously discussions about ICT for development. There's a huge body of literature that you probably know better than me. I find in particular good for this context quote from the paper by Christianta Viguru that she says that while primary motivation of ICT for the researchers is appreciation of the potential of ICT innovation to contribute to the improvement of human condition, we also witness in our research that the falsity of widely held technology deterministic expectations that ICT, by virtue of its technical properties, will have this or that development effect. So it's important to consider what is development and what is the role of information technologies for development. On the other hand, there are a lot of different views about crowdsourcing. So we have a very optimistic views about crowdsourcing technologies that are presented by participatory culture framework and theory by Jenkins, peer production, long tail by Chris Anderson, the cognitive surplus by Shirky, where we have a lot of examples about crowdsourcing as something that empower people and support generosity. And on the other hand, we have dystopic views of crowdsourcing as something that supports big firms and companies and something that's used for profit and is exploitation of people, which kind of more associated with neo-Marxist theories. So the three major questions that I need in order to address in order to talk about these issues. First of all, what is crowdsourcing? Because there are a lot of different definitions. The second is what is the role of ICTs for development in my particular conceptual framework. And the third is what is special about emergencies for the context of ICT for development. So the first question, what is crowdsourcing? As I mentioned, there are a lot of different definitions and there are a lot of different approaches about the purpose of crowdsourcing. If it's a new business model for the production of different type of goods, if it's a form of digital labor, which is something again associated more with neo-Marxist approach to crowdsourcing, if it's about problem solving, there are different fields where crowdsourcing can be applied. There are a lot of arguments about who participate in crowdsourcing. Is it only about organizations that engage people or people to people? The structure of the relationship between participants and what type of resources can be mobilized for crowdsourcing. So there are very big body of literature today. For my particular purpose, when I was analyzing and trying to understand what crowdsourcing is about, I use this type of definition, which is really addressing important feature of crowdsourcing that is not that cannot be found in other online platforms. And what I'm trying to argue is that in crowdsourcing platforms, we always see a link between communication to action. So there is always some kind of embedded notion that people share information in order to activate and engage other people in some type of activity. So the definition that I use is that crowdsourcing is ICT-mediated mobilization of networked individuals and crowds resources in order to achieve a particular goal. And in a particular case, when it has been done by people to people and not only by organizations to people, we also can use Castell's notion of mass self-communication and to approach crowdsourcing as a form of mass self-mobilization, when again crowdsourcing is a specific form of mass self-communication that through the structural properties of the platform links communication to mobilization of resources. And we can talk about very different type of resources. If it's about sensor resources, people see something and they report about it. If it's about intellectual resources, the knowledge and experience of people, analytical resources, when it's about data mining, crowdfunding, when it's about financial resources and other type of resources, when there are also some physical action offline based on mobilization through crowdsourcing. But when I try to conceptualize these issues that about crowdsourcing, so in particular in the context of natural disasters, I faced a number of conceptual challenges. First of all, as we could see, the different views about crowdsourcing, if it's about positive or negative, it's about this topic, or if it's about some kind of optimistic notion. So I try to be neutral. The second thing is about power relationship, because most of the concepts ignore the power relationship when they apply crowdsourcing. Obviously, neo-Marxist theories have a very specific notion about power relationship, but some of the theories also don't really have it as a part of the conceptual frameworks. When we talk about crowdsourcing and natural disasters, what is in particular important is that we talk about a relationship with some kind of non-human actor, because natural disaster, if it's about fire, if it's about earthquake, is a situation when people address something that is not created by people. So we need to think how to embed in this context the relationship between human and non-human actors. Also, as I mentioned, I was in particular interested in comparative analysis of how the same platforms used in different socio-political environments, which means that this kind of socio-political factor should be addressed. And the last but not the least, that this framework should distinguish crowdsourcing from other forms of internet platforms, applications, and to kind of define crowdsourcing as something specific that is different from other platforms. So I tried to play with the different theories, and I will not spend too much time on explaining why I'm not going to use these theories, but what I consider it is a collective and connective action by Bennett and Segerberg, social affordances concept, obviously Castell's theory of networking power, and since we're talking about relationship with non-human actors, you cannot ignore Bruno Latour and actor network theory. Again, maybe later as a part of response to the questions, I can explain why I found this theory is not really helpful to address what I was interested in, but maybe it will be also clear from my theoretical framework that I'm going to present in the next slide. So eventually, when I tried to map all these different theories, and I found that it was not really helpful to address the issues that I'm interested in, I decided to use a theory that is that has been used for the last few years as a part of human-computer interaction research. But this theory, the origins of this theory are very different. They come from developmental psychology. They come from something that was developed originally in Russia. And this is a theory that is called cultural historical psychology. And later, it's known as the cultural historical activity theory, or the abbreviation is CHET. So the basic cultural historical psychology was developed in 20s, I think it's almost 100 years ago in Russia, as a part of effort by Lev Vygotsky, a prominent Russian psychologist, to explain the development of higher cognitive functions of people. And the major argument of the theory was that we cannot separate between the environment and the individual, and the development of the cognitive functions is a part of development in the social environment. So the major argument of the theory was that organism and the environment are the single unit of analysis, and that we develop, and our cognitive functions are developed through the cultural means that are surrounding us, and that we cannot separate the cognitive functions and the surrounding environment. And Vygotsky introduced this triangle, which is a kind of core element in his concept, when he argued that the major role in development of our functions belong to artifacts that surround us. So there is no direct relationship between the person and the surrounding environment, but there are always a lot of different objects that kind of include historical and cultural values. And if, for instance, I use the spoon when I eat my cake or whatever, so this spoon is a product of a cultural and historical process, and the way I use the spoon as a small child and the way I use it is something that defines the way I act and the way I live. Our interaction with different type of artifacts that mediate our activities with surrounding environment is something that actually develop us as individual beings. So the major arguments that can be applied to this theory is that all human experiences is shaped by the tools and science systems we use, and the structure of tool itself, as well as learning how to use a tool, change the structure of human interaction with the world. Later, so this is the focus of Vygotsky was very individual focus. It was focused on development of cognitive functions of an individual, but the people who followed Vygotsky applied this notion to social systems. And the first to do it was another Russian psychologist, Alexei Leontief, who suggested that activity should be a major level for analysis of social systems. And the famous example from his scholarship is analysis of the tribal hunt, when he argues that we cannot understand the situation of how people use different tools and what's going on in this situation without analyzing the general situation of activity and activity system, and what is the place of different tools that mediate the activity and how this activity is organized. The last contribution, not the last, but the last major contribution that kind of popularized this theory to the global audience was this triangle that represents the structure of human activity system. This is something that was introduced first by Engström in 1987, and this is something that is most famous image that associated with activity system theory today in the literature, including human-computer interaction literature and some other fields that use activity theory. So Engström argued that in addition to this basic triangle that was introduced by Vygotsky, the relationship between subject and object, the purpose of activity that is mediated through different type of tools, we also should apply this notion to social systems, and we can find that activity system includes the community around the people that use a particular type of tool, the rules how people use this tool, and the division of labor between the community, within the community, how people use this type of tool. And I will just present a case study to make it much more clear in the next slide. So let me just show you one example from something that is really related to natural disasters, and maybe it will make this concept a little bit more clear. And there is a very famous artifact which kind of came back to Russian public agenda during the wildfires in 2010, and it's called Rinda. Rinda, it's actually the bell that people ring when emergency situation happens. So it's a very kind of traditional form of emergency call. And if someone see fire, so they use this bell, and they call for all people that hear this bell for help, and then something happens and the emergency response starts to develop. So the idea is, first of all, that this bell, actually the more common name for this bell in Russia is not Rinda. Rinda comes from kind of more sea context, from ships, and it comes from actually English ring the bell, but Rinda or Nabat, which is another name for this bell, is a very kind of traditional artifact that could be found in many different villages in 18th and 19th century, and was used as a part of response. So this is an artifact that mediated particular type of activity, because on the one hand we have individuals who live in this village, on the other hand we have a fire and the emergency response, which is the purpose of activity. And then the questions that we can ask about this artifact, what type of activity it mediates, is first of all, who is the community who respond to this bell? What are the rules, who can ring this bell? What are the expectations about this bell? Who can access this bell? And what is the division of labor between the people who respond to this bell? So in this case, this bell mediates some kind of activity system in order to respond to disaster. And it's a cultural and historical artifact, because with many years this artifact developed, and it was used, and it was traditionally used by people in villages. And already you are born in this system when you have this bell, and this bell creates around itself a type of activity system, which is the emergency response activity system. What is really interesting that obviously in 20th century these bells disappeared from villages, and they were exchanged and were replaced by more advanced forms of emergency response, firefighters, a state-backed system of response to fires. But the problem is that in Russian case, this traditional state-backed system didn't really work, and people were very frustrated about what the government did about response to wildfires. So they asked, and some bloggers, and that's why it was so famous in 2010 in Russia, they asked to bring the bell back, to bring the ring back. And one blogger wrote a very prominent letter to President Putin. He was a prime minister at this time, and asked to ring the bell and actually to restore the previous activity system in response to fires. So you could find that actually this bell, the rinda, became a mem, but also a symbol of traditional activity system. And later, some colleagues of mine also developed a platform which is called the virtual bell, rinda, which is an idea that we need to introduce online also this type of bell that people can ring, and other people in online community will respond in order to provide help. So this is just one example for mediating artifact, but let me now talk a little bit about another aspect of my questions, and is about the emergencies and development in order to match these things together and to start discussing the case studies. So the other side of the triangle is the relationship between disasters and development. And here I find in particular important a book that was written by Frederick Cooney about disasters and development, where he argues that there is some kind of conceptual failure by aid organizations to link disasters to development, and the disasters create a momentum for development, and it's not only about just providing food and water and some basic needs for the people who are affected by disaster, but disaster allow to restructure and recreate and to create a new type of institutions and new type of system, and that's the major opportunity about disaster. And for instance, as we know in London, the Great Fire in 1666 totally destroyed the city, but it was also a beginning of the new city, and it was a beginning of the new development. So every disaster is an opportunity to start something new. By the way, I have to mention that Frederick Cooney, if you are not familiar, is a very interesting and tragic person who was killed in Chechnya in 1996, I think, and his personal history is also very interesting in this context, and there is a book, The Man Who Tried to Save the World, which is a really important and interesting book about his biography and his story. So here we come to the notion that disasters have some kind of political value, and not only actual value about how they destroy the infrastructure. And there are different theories that try to explain the link between political context and the disasters. So that's some arguments that made by Mark Pelling and Catherine Deal about the fact that while state failed to create a response to disaster, it creates a vacuum that can be filled by other actors, and it always creates an opportunity for political change. So it's approached as a tipping point. At the same time, there are some other arguments that at least if it's not a tipping point, but at least it's a stress test for traditional institutions. And later an argument about the relationship between political environment and disaster was introduced in this book that was just published in Oxford University Press, which is a book about information and communication technologies in areas of limited statehood. It's a book that was edited by my colleagues Stephen Livingston and Gregory Asmolov, and it's tried to explore the association between development of the role of information technologies for development and the degree of statehood. Again, I will maybe talk a little more about it, but the idea is that the limited statehood, limited capacity of the state to provide basic goods for people is different from the traditional notion of failing state or weak state, because it can be regional, it can be situational, it can be something that happens as a part of a natural disaster in a very specific region. And that's something that also argues that limited statehood can be experienced not only in developing countries, but also in the well-developed countries. And that's again something that supports the argument that you can approach states that are not considered traditionally as developing as a part of this argument about ICT4D and its role for development. And what is also interesting as a part of this book is that you can think about development of new modes of governance relying on information technologies in cases of limited statehood where traditional institutions fail to provide the response, and this is something that we can see in cases of disasters. So let me finish the theoretical part with trying to link all these things together. The activity theory, as I mentioned, also started from developmental psychology, and it also makes some strong arguments about development and about situations that can be considered as emergency situations. I'm not trying to argue that we need to take something from the individual level of developmental psychology and apply it to social context, but there's some insights, and also as a part of cultural historical activity theory that is focused more on social level than on psychological level, there are some interesting things that can contribute to understanding of the role of the activity systems to development context. So on the individual level, the traditional cultural historical activity theory talks about development of child as a part of responding to environment and as a part of studying to use different type of artifacts, and it emphasizes the unity of the material, of the surrounding and the mental, and the unity of the social and the personal. It also introduced the idea of the zones of proximal development as a kind of the possibility of the expensive transformation in activity systems. What are the possibilities how this activity system can be expanded through learning of using different type of artifacts. And it also makes some arguments about how the activity system develops when there are two types of forms of development. One is about contradictions with environment, and in this case natural disasters is something that creates contradiction between social system and the environment and introduce challenges that force the system to respond and to develop new forms of activity, and contradictions within the system between the nodes of the triangle that was illustrated and shown before, when, for instance, there is a tension between the community and the rules, or the community and the tools, or the community and the division of labor, and it forces the system to change. So relying on these things, what we can try to argue is that emergencies provide an opportunity for development of new activity systems and new social functions through mediating artifacts. And in this particular case, the information technologies crowdsourcing platforms are the systems, are the artifacts that allow to introduce new forms of activity systems. So here, when we talk about Ushahidi as an example for mediating artifacts, so we can ask the following questions about this triangle. So on the one hand, we have the responders, the internet users, the online volunteers, the offline volunteers. On the other hand, we have the natural disaster, and we have the platform as an artifact that mediate activity in response to this disaster. And the major question is how this platform is structured. What type of community emerged around this platform, what type of division of labor can be seen in this platform, and what are the rules that they apply to this platform. And the major idea is to approach crowdsourcing as something that mediates emergence of activity systems. Here, the major arguments are, first of all, that crowdsourcing platforms mediate activity and should be analyzed in the context of activity system. Development of new forms of activity systems can be achieved through mediating artifacts, and then the existence of these artifacts can contribute to new forms of activity as a part of the system. And finally, disasters are momentum, create a momentum for development of new forms of activity systems. So now I'm done with all the theoretical issues, and now I hope that it will be much more clear what I'm talking about, relying on a few case studies that based on my fieldwork in Russia and Australia, I conducted about 65, 70 interviews and also conducted some ethnographic observations about how people use different type of information technologies as a response to emergency situations, and also conducted some analysis of some online analysis of crowdsourcing platforms. So here the list of the possible methods that can be used in order to analyze the activity systems. So first, let me start with the online dimension. So here are the two shady deployments that were created in response to floods in Russia and in Australia. On the left is a deployment that was created as a response to floods in Kuban area in South Russia. And on the right is a deployment in response to floods in Brisbane and Queensland in Australia. So the first dimension of trying to evaluate how the activity system is structured and what kind of activity system are mediated is the structure of categories. Because the structure of categories on crowdsourcing platforms, and in particular on the Shade, is very flexible. And you can define what information is collected, what kind of activities are requested. So if we focus on the Russian categories, so the major categories are focused on needs of people and on what type of resources are available. So here the transport is required, the evacuation is required, the volunteers are required, and the major forms of activity that are kind of defined by the structure of categories are related to mutual aid between people to people. And obviously it's also related to the identity of the people who launched this platform, because here it's just a group of online volunteers who are not affiliated with any institution. And the focus is, again, is crowd-to-crowd facilitation of mutual aid between people in case of a disaster situation. The Australian platform is more focused on just collection of information about what's happening. It's not about facilitation of action offline between volunteers, but it's more about collecting of data from different sources and aggregation of information from different sources. So it's more about mapping, and another difference is that the identity of the one who deployed the platform, in this case is the Australian Broadcasting Company, is in someone who is actually officially responsible for emergency communication in Australia, so it's more institutional actor. So here, when we conduct online analysis, we can see how categories in crowdsourcing platforms define the boundaries of activity systems and what type of activities are mediated and what kind of resources are mobilized through crowdsourcing platform. When here it's more kind of sensor resources, just monitoring and collection of data and creating situation awareness. And in this case, it's more about facilitation of offline activity. What is interesting that crowdsourcing allows to move from a traditional taxonomy of disaster when categories are defined by institutional actor to taxonomy of disaster when the categories of activities are defined by users themselves and more flexible, which kind of makes the activity system to more flexible also. What is also interesting about the platforms, so here on the left we can see three platforms, actually two platforms and an image from Twitter from Australia. And these platforms were launched by just internet users that were interested in helping to victims of the floods in Queensland. And this is something that people in Australia call spontaneous volunteerism. These are not people who have any type of skills. These are just internet users who are interested in helping. So this platform, Flood8, was structured in a very similar way to the Russian platform, Help Needed and Help Offered. This platform, Queensland Floods, was focused on providing open beds for people. And in Twitter, we can see how hashtags also define different type of activities. Because sometimes hashtags are not only about just mentioning the floods, but also arguing about particular form of response that is required to these floods. So when we talk about the community of spontaneous volunteers, we can see that the division of labor around these platforms is not really well structured. They are more kind of generative in the sense of what Jonathan Zitrin talks about generativity as something that creates an unexpected outcome. So here there is no specific functions. When we talk about the communities of professional volunteers, so their activity is based on their identity as volunteers and a very different type of artifacts. It's not about these online platforms, but for instance, the major mediating artifact for these people is the traditional pagers, because these people have pagers, and once something happens, they are mobilized through these pagers, and the mediating artifact that creates community and activity system. So all the people who have this artifact, they share the same community. They are part of the same community, and they're mobilized through this artifact in order to respond. So there is a different type of communities that emerge around a different type of artifacts. And here the division of labor is very well structured and relies on training and experience. And here it's unstructured. Another case study that I used was not really traditional disaster, but something that can be approached as a disaster or emergency situation is a search and rescue for missing people. And here you can actually argue if it's really a disaster or not, because in Russia it's a really kind of a big problem, since every summer hundreds and hundreds of people get lost in forests, and the traditional institutions and police and emergency services don't have enough capacity to address this problem. So there are a few different type of projects in Russia in order to search for people who got lost. There is a famous project that's called Lisa Alert, which is an online community of volunteers who mobilized every time when something happens. They just get a text message or they get a message online, and they go to the specific point to start and look for these people. And this is an unbounded community because anyone can join without any prior requirements. There is a different type of bounded communities of professionals of search and rescue that are still not affiliated with government, but in order to be a part of this community, you need to get in, and you need to get approval from the coordinators of this community. But still, the people who kind of activate this community are these independent people who created these organizations. And all these type of structures that relies on online platforms, because again, the activation and the creation of community and the definition of what should be done by people in the situation when someone is lost is done and mediated by these platforms. It's pretty different from what happens in Australia, because in Australia there are some search and rescue groups and they have some websites, but these these groups are activated by police and only by request from police. They're not independent groups. They're definitely very close groups of very professional search and rescue people. So what we can see is that there are different structure of mobilization and different community, if it's an open community, if it's a closed community, and the identity of the mobilizer, if it's a self-mobilization or it's a mobilization by the police or some institutional actors, is also very different. So as a part of investigation, I conducted some ethnographic observations. I joined for search and rescue groups, and in particular Lisa Alert. So it was really interesting to see how, as a part of the search and rescue, they use the different type of information technologies and what define for them to be a part of the same community, how they, what are the rules around using these technologies, and you can map the number of tools and number of online platforms and the offline tools, and how they are interrelated in order to understand what type of activity system is created around these tools. So the rules and protocols of mobilization, again, as I said, as I mentioned before, different type of platforms define different type of frameworks for what is considered to be as mobilization and when people are called to respond to the disaster. So here, for instance, this is an example of the text messages that people get through Lisa Alert, and someone is missing, and they say who is this person who is missing, and where they should look for this person. Some other, and at the same time, and this is probably one of the last examples from my case studies, at the same time, what is interesting is that the government is also trying to create a similar type of systems in order to respond to emergency. The most famous and most prominent platform that was created on this field by Russian Ministry of Emergency, which is kind of a very traditional and institutional organization, is a platform that's called Dobrovolets.rf, volunteer.rf. And this is a platform that was supported by traditional institutions. And the idea was also to create a group of volunteers who can register and who can be mobilized based on platform in case of emergency. But what is really interesting, and it took me some time to investigate this platform and to make interviews with different people who are associated with this platform, that unlike in other platforms, there is no transparency about the protocols of mobilization, about the forms of activity that are mediated. So people are registered for this platform, but they don't really know how the people from this platform will use them. And there are eventually a lot of conflicts around this platform that took place because it looks like, and some people who were affiliated with this platform also say that this platform was created in order to control the people and in order to keep this list of potential responders, but not really engage them. And here the lack of transparency around what type of activities are mediated is more used to control than to engage people, and that's why I think it can be called as a passivity systems, because actually what is mediated is not forms of not forms of activity, but forms of passivity. And here we can see a title from Russian media that says that Kremlin is going to deal with crowdsourcing. So it looks like that there are attempts to experiment with these technologies in order to neutralize this impact of these technologies as a form of activation of people and trying to control people through this type of platforms. What is also really important is the degree of integration between traditional and non-traditional organizations that are mediated through these platforms. So here in Australia we can see, for instance, these are photos from a situational room of emergency response to bushfires. That there are different type of volunteers. This is a guy who is a traditional firefighter from administrator of the local firefighting unit. There are some traditional volunteers who are part of the professional group, and these people from MAPS, it's an online volunteer group of GIS experts who are called to be a part of the situation room in case of emergency. So there are different forms of integration between the volunteers and traditional professional emergency response people. And again, you can see how these groups emerge online, but they collaborate with traditional organizations. And just one example for how this division of labor between different organizations can work. For instance, OCHA, which is an organization that's responsible for humanitarian assistance in the UN that responded to Yolanda, the typhoon in the Philippines, was in touch with an online group, which is a coalition of online volunteers that called Digital Humanitarian Network. A part of this organization is a professional, semi-professional network of online volunteers that called Standby Task Force that get some training in order to respond to disasters. But the last time, just a few months ago, the new platform was used, which is a micromappers platform that allows to people with no any training just to crowdsource data mining and analyzing of images from the area of disaster. So you could see a very interesting type of division of labor when there is a traditional responder for disaster. There are professional online volunteers who have some training, and there is a platform that mediates activity that allows to engage for people without any training. And all these things together emerge to some kind of activity system in response to disaster with a different type of skills required in order to respond, and different type of division of labor, different type of activities. I'll skip this slide, and I'm very close to my conclusion. I will just mention that what is important also, that different type of crowdsourcing platforms mediate different type of construction of the disaster. So in Russia, the traditional media try to say that everything is under control, and once people get information that everything is under control, it means that there is no activity that is required in order to respond to disaster. On the other hand, when you look on crowdsourcing platform, you see that everything is burning and nothing is happening, like no one is responding. So it means there are a lot of space for activity that's required in order to respond. So the way the situation is communicated has a very big value for actually how the activity system can be structured. And from the state's point of view, sometimes the effort to control how the situation is communicated is an attempt to prevent emergence of forms of activity by people relying on these technologies. On the other hand, in Australia, the situation is quite opposite, because when you follow what the Australian social media say and what the institutional actors in Australian social media say, here, for instance, this is an image from mobile application. that show fires around you, and it says status out of control. This is something that you cannot imagine happening in Russia. In Russia, the message always is that everything is under control. Here, the purpose is probably totally opposite. Is just to say to people, please leave your places, please leave your villages. This is a dangerous situation. We cannot we cannot guarantee you that we will take care of you. Please leave your places. So it's also about very different relationship between the state and the people. Here another kind of concluding image that can say a lot. So the traditional form of mobilization from state or from institutes to people, this is a traditional image that also can be seen in different contexts in states. Have you been registered as a volunteer? This is a part of recruiting to the Red Army in the 20s. And here the same image is used by volunteers that responded to Russian wildfires, but the identity of the one who mobilized and they create this activity system is different. Here it's the institution, here it's the people themselves. So there are different type of models that can be associated with a different type of political environments. If it's about close top-down mobilization, bound and bottom-up, the structure of community, and what is the structure of relationship between online volunteers and the traditional institutions. I will skip this one. It's just the idea is again that every activity system can be placed if it's citizen-driven or state-driven, if it's provides more opportunities for activity of people or for kind of passivity. What are the actions that are mediated through online artifacts and crowdsourcing systems, and what is the division of labor? And this is actually the one before the last slide. That what I'm trying to argue is that it can be applied not only for natural disasters. This is just a part of a new paper that was submitted recently. It's still not published. That in different type of mapping platforms you can analyze the mapping activity. So OpenStreetMap collection of data, the geographical data, the collection of data about a particular issue, and the activity that can be enabled by a particular map, and the relationship between once we approach the online maps as a mediating artifact, so we can ask questions on the one hand about the mapping activities, the collection of data for this map, but on the other hand, what kind of activity was enabled and what kind of activity system was created around this map, and the structure of the relationship between mapping as activity and mapping enabled activity is something that can help to understand a lot of different case studies, because sometimes in some case studies we can see that there are a lot of mapping that have been done, but there is no action that was followed by this mapping, so there is no mapping enabled activity, and there is sometimes integration between the mapping and the mapping enabled activity that can be found in different projects. So to conclude, what I try to argue is, first of all, that a crowdsourcing platform is an example of mediating artifact, and we can see that a different type of activity can be mediated through these platforms. The terminology and the conceptual framework is provided by cultural historical activity theory, and the concept of zones of proximal development is something that can be used for thinking about development of new forms of activity systems. We can think about development as something that we can approach it as a form of development of new activity systems, and use framework that was suggested by the triangle with the community, division of labor, the rules, and the role of mediating artifacts, in this case different type of online platforms, not only crowdsourcing platforms but also other platforms, as something that create different form of activity. And if we think about activity as the major level of analysis, is something that helps us to think about the role of ICT4D in a way that connects online and offline dimensions. So what I try to suggest that ICT4D should consider activity as level of analysis and explore how ICT as a mediating artifact can be used for development of activity systems that mediate new social functions. Using the situations of contradiction, like emergency situations, can be a successful context in order to introduce new systems for activity. So in case of a natural disaster in Russia, it was the first time when crowdsourcing platform Shady was used in Russia, but following our example, we had dozens and dozens different types of deployments of crowdsourcing in Russia, and today crowdsourcing is a very popular tool for social innovation and for different type of social entrepreneurship. So we could see that the situation of natural disasters, because of the challenges and contradictions, was a successful momentum to use the system first time, and following using the system, in the case of disaster, the same systems were used in different type of context in creation different type of activity systems around different topics. And the final point is that we can expand that in different socio-political environments we can see different type of activity systems. If these activity systems in situations of limited statehood, when there is a new mode of governance and new forms of activity that substitute the lack of action by traditional actors, or it's about the synergy between traditional institutions and the online volunteers, and the way that these online platforms as mediating artifacts contribute to synergy between different type of actors, which could be seen in the Australian case study, and also around the way that information technologies were used in response to a typhoon in Philippines. So this is just a beginning of my kind of trying to analyze this data. So I still have a long way to run, as I mentioned, as a part of my PhD. But I still think that using the framework of activity system can be valuable, at least for facilitation of thinking about the role of information technologies for ICT4D. And that's what I try to argue, relying on the case studies from natural disasters and crowdsourcing field. Thank you.